I like to have my ducks in a row. I like things organized and scheduled, and most of all, predictable. My wife sometimes says that makes you boring too. But that's the way I am, I guess. And maybe it's a little bit of the culture in which I was raised. And I think that's partly why the idea of biblical inerrancy was so attractive to me when I was in my late teens and my early years of adulthood. Biblical inerrancy fits in with this feeling of wanting things organized and controllable and predictable. And it makes religion clear-cut and predictable. And it also helps you in your own mind to determine very clearly who's in and who's out of the community of God. I guess that makes me and evangelicalism very modern. Now, why do I say that? Well, the modern world really had its beginnings with what we often call the Enlightenment in the late 1600s and early 1700s. During those years, people were fed up with 100 years of religious wars that came out of the time of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. They had had a century of war and they were fed up with it. They didn't know how to manage or control religion, so people like John Locke and Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton said, let's just take the facts, the basic physical facts of life, and let's try to organize them in a way that makes the most sense to the most people, and just focus on that and try to build a little bit of a better world out of that. Maybe we can get more unity. Maybe we can build a better way to organize ourselves in better human life. And that really is the roots of a lot of modern science, with all the progress that modern science has made. And that helped spawn modern industry, which helped spawn the modern economy. And all of that kind of came out of this idea of let's see if we can just focus on the basic facts and see if we can organize them in a way that makes sense to the most people. And that caught on like wildfire. It just, people in Europe became almost intoxicated with this idea because it seemed to work and it seemed to help calm things down and just focus on making life a little better for people. Some people took this to more of an extreme though. There were atheists in the Enlightenment period that wanted to focus so much on what was predictable that they identified what is predictable to the human mind with what is real. And they wanted to eliminate any idea of a supernatural, and that word really comes from that time, a supernatural or a spiritual influence in life. The idea of a miracle or something like that became very difficult because they wanted to focus on what's predictable, and you can't predict what spirit or what God will do. So some atheism came out of that. But there was also a change in some religious people as well. They wanted to say that, well, God created the world, and then he or she or God, it went out and left everything, gave us some instructions on how to handle it, some rules on how things work, and left us to figure it out for ourselves. Again, according to what makes sense to our minds. And so they were called deists because they believed in God, but they believed God had left the world in a very predictable format for us to handle for ourselves. Thomas Jefferson and a lot of the founding fathers were Christians, but they were deistic Christians, and they embraced that point of view. And it tended to be a root of what we call today modern secularism, because it tended to banish the spiritual from life with an emphasis on physical facts. Biblical inerrancy, as evangelicals embrace it today, comes out of that time. Now, Christians had always believed that the Bible was reliable in its message and trusted that. But during this time, people were so caught up in this idea of let's find the facts, let's organize them in a predictable way. They wanted to do that with the Bible as well, especially after the Protestant Reformation and all the upheaval that kind of came out of that. And so an idea of biblical inerrancy developed, which was very focused on the literal and very focused on finding some key facts and organizing them in a way that was clear-cut and that could clearly point to who's in and who's out. And that became a foundation of how evangelicals saw the truth and what is real, what is predictable, were identified. And biblical inerrancy in the evangelical perspective is part of all of that. So today, if you question biblical inerrancy to an evangelical, it's very, very threatening because you're questioning that predictability of their faith. And ultimately, you're questioning their concept of who's in and who's out? My preacher, my evangelical preacher, when I was in my college years at an evangelical Christian college, said that if you can find one error, one contradiction in Scripture, the whole thing falls apart. And from that mindset, it does fall apart. If the truth of the Bible rests on us being able to organizing the facts of Scripture into a predictable pattern, then one contradiction blows the whole thing. But if God is real, and if God is free, can we really predict what God's going to do? Does the Bible always want its ducks in a row? And maybe even more to the point, we'll talk about next time, are the Bible's ducks in a row? Or does the Bible have something to say to us that challenges our concept of what is real and what is possible and who's in and who's out? Now, what do you think? How does this strike you? Do you agree, disagree, or would you like to offer some other thoughts? If so, put them in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you have to say.